The book of Genesis, or as it's called in Hebrew, Bereshit, after the first word in the Torah, in the beginning, is actually a book about origins, about beginnings. And it speaks about the origins of the world at large and humanity, as well as, of course, the origins of the Jewish people. And the distinction between these two origin stories, I believe, is the actual logical and most instinctive way to divide the book of Breshit into two. Its first section, from chapters 1 till almost the end of chapter 11, deals with the origins of the world and of humanity, while from chapter 11, verse 27 and onwards, we begin the patriarchal narrative, the stories of the forefathers of the Jewish people, and hence the origins of the people. Now, this division can actually pertain not only to Bereshit, to Genesis, but actually to the Bible at large, where you could, even though it's not mathematically a suitable division, but as far as content and perspective, one can distinguish between the first 11 chapters of the Bible, which relate to humanity at large in a general way, and from the end of chapter 11, the beginnings of the story of the Jewish people, which continues till the end of the Bible. And this schism, this distinction, is quite dramatic. The first 11 chapters, usually called the primordial or the primeval history, of course, relate from the beginnings of creation till the election of Abraham. And they are substantially different in the nature of the narrative from the rest of the Bible. For one, like we just said, the perspective is, of course, universal. It talks about all of humanity. All the humanity is affected by the flood. The Tower of Babel actually speaks about all of humanity. Whereas from the story of Abraham and onwards, it is a story focused on first a family and then one people out of that humanity. But in addition to the perspective, there's also a dramatic change in the nature of the narrative and primarily its recount of history. From a chronological perspective, the primordial history actually spans much more time than the rest of the Bible, from the story of Abraham till the very end, the return in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah back to Israel. From a chronological perspective, if we count the number of generations, we're talking about 20 generations spanning the primordial history. And as far as years, it's quite close to 2,000 years if we keep the biblical chronological account. Abraham, according to the calculations, interestingly enough, is born at around the year 1948 from creation, following the years in Genesis. This number, curiously, of course, rings a bell, 1948, if we're talking about beginnings. So we're almost at 2,000 years up till Abraham, and from Abraham and onwards, it's 1,500 years till the end of the biblical period. So we can see 11 chapters cover far more time than the rest of the whole Bible. And hence we can see a dramatic change in narrative time versus chronology, where here the gap is awesome in the primordial history, whereas in the rest of the Bible, the stories are, of course, a lot more in depth. And you can say that the primordial history has a more cursory overview of the period. And that, of course, tells us a lot. It's not as an in-depth account. And to a large extent, it has a function as giving the background to the election of the Jewish people. So both as far as perspective, universal versus particular, and chronology and the relation between narrative time and actual historical time, we see dramatic differences, but nonetheless, they are interconnected, of course, these two sections, the primordial and the rest of biblical history, because one serves as the background, the backbone to the rest of the biblical history. And of course, that's important from a theological perspective, that the Bible, the Torah and the Bible don't just begin with the Jewish people, but begin with God, the creator, who creates all of humanity. And from a theological perspective, that's an important statement, that this is not only the God of Israel, but this is the God of all of humanity. Now, what we have to try to investigate is exactly what is the nature of the primordial history and its role as a background to the rest of the Bible and to the election of Abraham and the Jewish people. If we analyze the primordial history, there's 11 chapters, they themselves can split into two periods: the pre-deluge, pre-flood period, and then following Noah was kind of like a second Adam, a new second beginning, from then onwards till the election of Abraham. Those are the two major sections. And we'll immediately begin with the first section, namely chapter 1 and the beginning of creation. Now, when we move to analyze a story, the first thing we have to do is, of course, determine its boundaries. And here there is something which is quite curious. We would have expected the boundaries to parallel the chapter division, and hence instinctively you ask, where does the first story conclude? So you say, with the end of chapter 1. However, if we inquire and look at the end of chapter 1, we see that it actually concludes with day 6 and not day 7. And therefore, we are quite surprised. Why would the Sabbath not be included in chapter 1? I'll just share a screen here. Here you can see the conclusion of chapter 1, the end of day 6, whereas chapter 2 begins with the Sabbath and finishes at the end of verse 3. So what's going on here? Why is the Sabbath in chapter 2? So one could say maybe it's geared towards isolating the Sabbath and showing how it's unique. And of course, that is definitely correct. The Sabbath in the story itself is totally different, as we will see from the rest of the days of creation. But that is no sufficient reason to put it in a separate chapter. I think it is quite clear that the Sabbath is part of the first story. The answer for this peculiar situation lies in identifying the source of the chapter division. For the chapter division is relatively late, and in fact, it is not of Jewish origin. It is usually attributed to Bishop Stephen Langton. Bishop Stephen Langton is a very important figure, historically speaking. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury, lived in the second half of the 12th century and the beginning of the 13th century. Eventually was elected as Archbishop of Canterbury after a lot of tension between King John and Pope Innocent III. And he's, of course, a central figure historically because he's one of the figures behind the famous Magna Carta of 1215, which basically limited the powers of the king and government and put them also beneath the law. But he's also, of course, a very important religious figure. He became archbishop for a reason, and he's also credited for the division of the Bible into the chapters that we have. And now the question is, what made Stephen Langton divide the first story in the manner that he did, where he shifted the Sabbath and put it in chapter 2. And I believe, this is of course speculation, but I believe that this is primarily of Christian theological motive. As we know, for Christianity also has a holy day, a day of rest. But interestingly enough, that day is not parallel to the day of the Jewish rest, not Sabbath Saturday, but rather Sunday. This is a development in later Christianity, and is probably motivated by the desire to distinguish between Christians and Jews in the beginnings of Christianity, and also to connect with other cultures and areas in which Christianity spread. But this created a problem. Why? Because it's clear that according to the opening story, the Sabbath is the end of the week. However, Sunday, in the typical structure of the 7-day week, is actually the first day of the week. Sunday, prior to Monday, which is Moon Day, etc. Right? So we begin with the most dominant of celestial bodies, the sun, and then the moon, etc. Moving forward, right? You can see the celestial bodies also in other days, also in other languages, right? In French, mercredi, Mercury, and vendredi, etc. And Saturn, Saturday, Venus, etc. So this created a problem. By the way, in some cultures, they shifted and decided to have the week end with Sunday. And in certain cultures, when you count the days of the week, you start with Monday and end with Sunday, even though I think in North America, you start usually Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, right? No, Saturday, Friday, Saturday, Friday, Saturday. Anyway, so the bishop sensed that there is a problem here, because on the one hand, you celebrate the day of rest in the beginning of the week, whereas the biblical account says that the day of rest is at the end of the week. So he had an interesting solution, to my mind, and decided to create a chapter division, which actually placed the Sabbath not at the end of the first chapter, but at the beginning of the second chapter, thereby kind of shifting the whole structure, in that it looks like the day of rest is a beginning. And that suits, of course, the later Christian tradition of celebrating the day of rest on Sunday, the beginning of the week, like it is in the beginning of chapter 2. Of course, there are certain streams in Christianity which wanted to repair this and bring the Sabbath back to Saturday, the end of the week, Seventh-day Adventists. However, this is, to my mind, quite an artificial division, sending the Sabbath into chapter 2. It is quite clear that the Sabbath is part of the first story and should have been part of chapter 1. And indeed, in the Jewish tradition, they didn't have a chapter division, but there were traditions of separating and reading portions of the Torah every Sabbath, and in Israel they actually read shorter portions in the beginning, not like we conclude the whole Torah nowadays in a year. It actually had a longer cycle of twice in 7 years. And the first portion that was read is the story of the 7 days of creation, including Sabbath. Furthermore, even nowadays, when we read the opening story, the first person who is called up to the Torah to make a blessing, the Kohen, he reads till after the Sabbath. In other words, the first Aliyah, the first person who goes up to the Torah in the Torah reading, actually reads till the end of the seventh day. You can see it, I'll show it in the Bible. There's even a sign. If you could take a look, I'll put it up close. You might be able to see that here is the chapter division. This is chapter 2. You might be able to see a bet here. But looking further down, you'll see that there is also a sheni. A little further down, that's after the seventh day. In other words, what is now in our Bibles, chapter 2, verse 4. That is where the second reader begins. Okay, so clearly the boundaries should be viewed as including the Sabbath, and there's of course several proofs for that. First of all, the actual motif of days, right? Sabbath is the seventh day, and obviously it's part of the story. In the next story, the story of the Garden of Eden, we have no mention of days. That relates only to the first story. And in addition, an immediate proof is that verse 4 in chapter 2 has the classic opening of stories in Genesis. Take a look here, Ele Toldot, right? These are the generations. It's like a classic opening sentence of story. It's parallel to, let's say, in folk stories, like in a long time ago in a distant land. So this is like Eile Todot. These are the generations. It's the classic opening. So that shows us that verse 3 of chapter 2 is the end of another story, as verse 4 is in the beginning. And finally, also a linguistic analysis, we can see that the final words in verse 3, the end of the first story, Asher bara Elokim la'asot, right, which God in creating had made, bara Elokim, parallels the opening of the story, Breshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created. So we have the same words, bara Elokim, God created, opening the first story and also concluding the first story, bara Elokim, and kind of an inclusio, right? So it's quite clear that the Sabbath is, of course, part of the first story. And therefore, if we summarize the boundaries of the first story, they begin from chapter 1, verse 1 till chapter 2, verse 3, inclusive. If you ask, why is the chapter division used also in Jewish Bibles and Hebrew Bibles, if it's, as I'm claiming, motivated by Christian religious considerations? The answer is quite technical, simply spread so fast, and especially when they started printing Bibles, the Bible being the first substantial important book, right, to be printed after the invention of print, and they were all printed with the chapter division. So it kind of seeped into Jewish Bibles in that way, and it became like an internationally used system, just like the Gregorian calendar, for that matter, right? And so out of, I guess, convenience, it's been printed in pretty much all Bibles, the chapter division, but the Jews have their own traditional division of aliyot, people being called up to the Torah, and there we see that Shabbat is part of the first aliyah, the first person who reads the Torah as it should be. So let us begin with a kind of overview. After we've determined the boundaries of the first story, let's try to understand what is the message behind this story. And this also connects to the opening interpretation of probably the most famous Jewish commentator, Rashi. So let's share with you also his commentary. This is the opening of Rashi. That's Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki. He lived in France at the end of the 11th century. and is the most well-known Jewish commentator printed in any Jewish Bible that will have a commentary, a traditional commentary. It'll always include Rashi. So let's see how Rashi, which is the acronym for his name, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki Rashi, you can see it. Let's see how Rashi opens his commentary. We'll read it in English. Said Rabbi Isaac, it was not necessary to begin the Torah except from this month is to you, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem in Hebrew, which is the first commandment that the Israelites were commanded. Now, for what reason did he commence with in the beginning? So Rashi asks an interesting question. He says, if we view the Torah as a book of commandments, why at all does the Torah start recounting creation? It should have begun with the first commandment. Now, this question is actually quite surprising because it assumes, it's a basic assumption behind the question is that the Torah is a book of commandments. Now, it's clear that the Torah has a lot of commandments, but it's not only a book of commandments, it's not only a list of commandments, it also has a lot of stories in it. But even if you may not agree with the assumption underlying this question and be surprised by it, nevertheless, the question exists, what is the purpose and what is the message behind this opening story? And let's see the answer that Rashi gives. Because of the verse, now he quotes another verse from the Psalms, a proof. The strength of his work he related to his people. In other words, God related his power in creation to give them the inheritance of nations. Right? In Hebrew, koch ma'asav higid la'amo latet lahem nachalat goyim. So based on this verse, God relates his power in order to give the Jewish people their inheritance, the land of Israel. How so? For if the nations of the world should say to Israel, you are robbers, for you conquered by force the lands of the 7 nations, they will reply, the entire earth belongs to the Holy One, blessed be he. He created and gave it to whomever he deemed proper. When he wished, he gave it to them. And when he wished, he took it away from them and gave it to us. So interesting, an opening Rashi, written, like I said, in the 11th century, end of the 11th century, but actually ringing and having a political consequence also in the modern times. The source of the claims of the Jewish people to the land of Israel lies in God being the creator and having given as creator the land to the Jewish people. First, he gave it to the Canaanites, the 7 nations of Canaan, and eventually decided to take it away from them and give it to the Jewish people. So that is why the Torah includes a story of creation, because God owns the land, and he will determine to whom he will give the land. Now, if we work on this premise, the truth is it would have just been enough to state that God created the world. We don't need anything beyond that. God created the world, and then you could move on and then gave to the Jewish people the land of Israel. That would have been sufficient. Why do you need the whole chapter? So we could accept maybe the logic behind it, but say it's not sufficient in explaining the narrative as a whole. What else does this narrative teach us? So we're familiar with the story in general, of course, with the 6 days and the 7th day of rest, which is sanctified. And then one could move and say, okay, so the purpose of the story of creation is actually to tell us the source of the sanctity of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is holy because God sanctified it after resting, following his 6 days of creation. Then the 7th day, he rested and made that day a day of rest, a day of sanctity. And it is indeed unquestionable that this story is one of the sources for the sanctity of the Sabbath. And interestingly enough, the creation of matter in general, the world, the physical world, is found in the opening story within the context of a time frame of the 7 days, right? And this actually suits quite well modern physics, where we see that there's the time is actually relative to space. It's very interesting here, hence that we have like a description of the two coming in together and being integrated, the creation of matter and time within the same narrative. But if we work on that explanation, namely that this story is meant to give us the source of the holiness of the Sabbath, it would have been enough simply to say, God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. We wouldn't need the whole of chapter 1. In fact, we could have just had the opening verses from chapter 2 to verses 1 to 3, and that would have been sufficient to tell us that the world was created in 7 days and the seventh day was sanctified. I think we have to search hence for additional meaning beyond what Rashi brought and beyond the suggestion of the story about the roots of the holiness of the Sabbath. Both of these explanations, I think, carry some weight, but they are insufficient in explaining the narrative as a whole. If we want to take a general perspective on the opening story, I think we can note certain texts, certain words, key words in the text, and here I'll show it to you in the Hebrew and just explain. Probably the most common word repeated in this chapter is probably the most common word in the Bible. That is the word highlighted here in yellow, vayomer, right? Vayomer, and God said, he said, vayomer, vayomer, he said. We count in the chapter as a whole 10 appearances of the word vayomer, interestingly enough, in the opening story. And this, as a key word, I think carries an important message that creation came via speech. By the way, in contrast to other mythological accounts of creation, which tend to be more violent, right? A struggle between gods, a war between gods, and creating a world out of the slaughtered body of one of the gods, right? Famous Babylonian mythology of Marduk slaughtering Tiamat, the goddess of the salt waters, and from her body creating the earth. It's a more violent description and physical kind of description. Here, the biblical account premises the creation on speech, and carries the message of the power of speech, right? God created via the word, which is, of course, an important idea. The power, I think, in general, of humanity, or created in the image of God, is the power of speech, right? Communication. In fact, the well-known phrase pronounced by magicians, right, when making a magic trick, doing a magic trick, is abracadabra, which, according to some, is rooted in the Aramaic and may be translated abra kedabra. Bra is to create. Abra, bereshit bara, kedabra, as I speak. I will create as I speak, right? God created out of speech, right? That's the magic of creation. That's also the message, the word vayomer, the power of speech. In addition, a central root is the word badal, to separate, hivdil. In the aqua here, you can see 5 times. God separates between light and darkness, between the upper waters and the lower waters, right? Between day and night, and light and darkness again, right? So that's a motif that is repeated in creation, the idea of separation, which is an important concept in the rest of Torah as well, right? The idea of separating, distinguishing between the pure and the impure, the good and the bad, right? So this tendency is already found in the story of creation. And finally, we can summarize that creation is viewed in a very positive way if we take an overview of the first chapter, because the word tov, right, appears And if you count the amount of times, 7 times, right, is are things described as being good, tov in the green, right? So we obviously have a very positive view of the world in this story of creation. So we have some ideas emanating from the key words here, whether it be the power of speech, the importance of making distinctions and separating, and also a positive evaluation of the world being a good place in the creation, at least. Right. Now, let us try to also try to understand the story via its structure, via structural analysis. If I would ask to separate the story of creation, right, the 7 days of creation into two, so the natural idea would be to have the 6 days in which God creates, and then the seventh day, this day of rest. So if we would uh, translate that into a mathematical equation, we would say that the structure of the story is basically 6 plus 1 equals 7. But as we'll try to show, there seems to be a different structure underlying this story. And for uncovering this structure, this very interesting structure, we need to once again refresh our memories and remember what was created each day. So what I'm going to ask you to do here is to even stop the lecture and just write down what was created on each of the 6 days before God rested, right? Like the first day, right? What was created on the first day? Light, right? God created light, and then move onwards. And then we'll try to analyze and see what we could learn from the organization of creation. So I hope you did this. And now let's see what the results are. What was created on each of the days? We'll take a look. So here we have the creation by days. Day 1, light. Day 2, sky and sea. God separates between the upper waters and the lower waters. Um, Originally, everything seemed to have been water, moisture, and then God decides to make a firmament and determine that there will be upper waters in the sky holding moisture and the waters below. Next stage, God separates in day 3 between land and sea, and then there's land, and the second part of day 3, there's also vegetation which sprouts from the land. Day 4, the luminaries. Day 5, we got the birds and the fish. Day 6, living creatures on land, and eventually humans. And finally, of course, we have the day of rest. Now take a look at this, and you may note something quite interesting in this structure. First, I'll just raise a question. There's something quite surprising in the ordering of creation, and that is the place of humans. It is surprising, particularly in light of the biblical perspective, which elevates humans, describes humans as being in the image of God, right? That the humans don't receive their own day, but rather are placed in the same day with other living creatures on the land. Right? This is kind of, I guess, insulting for humans. Don't we deserve to get our own day? And it wouldn't have been too difficult. It could have been done by just shifting all animals on one day, on day 5, and then having day 6, the day of the creation of humanity. But why leave humans in the same day as animals? So one can say, well, maybe there's some support for some Darwinian claims of connections between humans and other creatures here. Humans also have some connections and parallels with animals. But even if so, it's clear that the biblical perspective, by and large, places humans in a separate category, like we said. And so, what made the Torah have humans fall on the same day as other animals? and not solve it simply by shifting the animals, all the animals, to day 5 and have a separate day for humans? And I think the answer is actually structural. If you look, one can note an interesting structure underlying these 6 days. Some days seem to connect with others. And Cassuto, an important scholar of the beginning of the 20th century, who was originally from Italy and came to Israel, he actually pointed out that the structure of the story is not 6 plus 1, but rather 3 plus 3 plus 1 equals 7. How so? So let's take a look. If you compare, you have seemingly 2 sets of 3 days. The first 3 days, light, sky and sea, land and vegetation. And then the next 3 days following, luminaries, birds and fish, animals on land and humans. And one can find clear correlations between these 2 columns. The first 3 days set the framework for the next 3 days. So day 1 establishes light, and then day 4 builds off that light and creates luminaries. Day 2 distinguishes between the sky and sea, the waters. Note there's still no land on day 2, and hence day 5, what forms of life, what animals are created? Only those that exist within the sea and in the sky, namely birds and fish. So birds were created, they may have been able to float on water, and they fly in the sky, right? And then only at day 3, when land and vegetation are created, then you have the next stage, the more advanced stage of life forms that live off the land and off the vegetation. Animals on land, and of course humans. And because of this structure, animals on the land could not have been placed on day 5, to my mind, but they had to appear in day 6 with the humans in order to create, right, this ongoing structure. Now, if we take a look, there's also another movement following these 2 columns. Light and luminaries, if we determine where are they located, so they're basically, you could say, in the sky, right? Second line, days 2 and 5 basically combine both sky and earth, right? Sky and earth. While days 3 and 6 focus solely on earth, right? Now, if you follow this, basically creation begins, if you could say creation is 2 stages, right? The first 3 days and the following 3 days, in both, you can see a movement from the creator being placed in the sky and then gradually moving down, sky and earth, and down to earth. And then also in the second category, the luminaries in the sky, gradually moving down, and then finally focusing on earth. So I think this is a neat, right, point that Cassuto noticed, that the structure is actually 3 plus 1. I think that's definitely true. But then we can say, okay, but what's the idea behind this? You can say, okay, we have the framework, and then we progress into more complex creations later. But is that all, or is there an additional message? And here, I want to try to build off the original structure pointed out by Cassuto and try to see if we can uncover an additional message. So when we read the story of creation, we can note that it's the most obvious literary feature of the story is its repetitions, right? We have the repetitive language throughout the days of creation, where God says, we emphasize the issue of speech. So God says, let there be light, and then it actualizes, there was light, and then he sees the light. Sometimes he gives names or distinguishes, and then finally we have the conclusion of the day, and there was evening and there was morning, etc. Day so and so. Right? This is a repetitive structure, linguistic framework that's found in the different days. God speaks every day, vayomer, vayomer, and it happens. And then God also, after creating, also sees what he created and says it was good. Vayar Elokim ki tov, and God saw the light that it was good. Right. So we can say that the repetitive structure includes, right, speech, creation, evaluation, it was good, and then conclusion of the day, and there was evening and there was morning. And we find that throughout the different days. God says, and then it actualizes, and then God saw that it was good, right, etc., etc. We can find this throughout the different days. So the story, as far as the 6 days of creation are concerned, have this repetitive cycle in it. But there are a couple of aberrations in that structure. For one, there is one day that doesn't have a positive evaluation, and that is in day 2. You ever notice day 2 does not say that God saw that the waters were good. Rashbam, Rashi's grandson, who lived in the following generations, in the 12th generation, 12th century, he actually comments on it and suggests that the Torah did not state that the waters were good because God is not finished yet with the water. Only in day 3, when he separates the land from the water, has he concluded his actions in relation to the water, and hence there's no positive evaluation in day 2 because it's not yet good. The work's not done yet with regard to the water, and that may be so that you could find in Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, Rashi's grandson, the famous Pshat commentator. I would also suggest an additional possibility. It could be that the absence of good in day 2 is actually meant to foreshadow. Namely, the Torah wants to state when in a situation where you only have water, that's what we had in day 2. God just separates the higher and lower waters, but you have no land, there's only water. Well, that's a sign that things are not good, and of course that may foreshadow what's going to happen later on in the primordial history, namely flood. So here we might also have some foreshadowing of future events in the book of Genesis. So we have an absence of good on one day, but there's another aberration. Not only is there a day that is missing the positive evaluation of good, but rather there is a day in which the word good, positive evaluation, appears twice. Where so? So if you take a look at days 3, when God first creates the land, in verse 10 it says, and God saw it was good. But in that same day, later on, when he creates the vegetation, right, and everything, and the tree bearing fruit, or in the seed thereof after its kind, and God saw that it was good. Once again, so interestingly enough, in day 3, where land and vegetation are created, there's a double good evaluation, right? Is there another day where there is a double good evaluation? And the answer is affirmative. That is day 6, interestingly enough. We take a look at day 6. Here too, we have a positive evaluation upon the creation of the animals on the land, right? In verse 25, God made the beast of the earth after its kind, etc., etc. And then at the end of the verse, it said, and God saw that it was good. But once again, at the end of day 6, the very end of the chapter, we see a general evaluation in verse 31. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. So we have a double good also in day 6. So if we return to our structure here of the days, that 3 plus 3 structure, let's take a look here. We note something interesting, that there are 2 days in which we see that good is emphasized. Day 3, we got a double good times 2, that's in day 3. And also in day 6, we got good times 2, whereas other days it appears once, like we said, with the exception of day 2. So is this good for our structure? Well, we said that days 3 and 6 are actually parallel days in the 2 columns, right? So it ends up, this actually strengthens our Kasuto's identification of a structure. Both days 3 and 6 are kind of 2-stage creation days. In day 3, we have land and vegetation, and in day 6, we have animals and then humans, and each get their own positive evaluation. So we have a double good. And here I close in on my proposal for a message that underlines this story of creation. In addition to presenting God as the creator and source of the whole world and ruler of the world, and in addition to the idea of the framework of time and highlighting the sanctity of the Sabbath, there is another, I think, message behind this story of creation. If we look, we'll note that good is emphasized in days that focus on the creation of land alone, right? Only the days that focus solely on creation on earth merit a double positive evaluation, good twice. Now, this is quite surprising. Usually, from a religious perspective, you ask the average, religious person, where is good to be found? So the answer will be, oh, there's in the world to come, in the next world, the Garden of Eden, right? That's the good world. That's where goodness can be found. This world is tainted by sin, right? Impurity and other defections, right? So we usually connect religious thought with more negative evaluations of this world and a more positive kind of search for goodness in a spiritual world to come. But interestingly enough, if we look at this account of creation, the message seems to be quite the opposite. This story seems to emphasize goodness in the world, not in the sky, right? Not above, but rather in this world, on earth. Right? And this is an idea, I think, which we find in other places, the emphasis right, in the Psalms, right, of life on earth. Hashamayim shamayim laHashem, the sky is to God. Va'aretz natan livnei adam, but earth was given to man. The Torah's idea, and it's found already in the opening story of creation, is that man can find goodness in this world. And of course, this connects with the emphasis of a positive evaluation of the world. We said the focus on the word tov, on the word tov, good, right? The world is positively viewed, and it's the emphasis of goodness is found on earth. This is where man can find goodness. In order to find purity and goodness and holiness, the Bible doesn't say that you have to disconnect from this world, right? And try to, go to create a different world. As we find in other religions, right? The concept of holiness in other religions is usually connected with Nazarites, people who who break out of society and out of civilization, and sometimes create monasteries, monks, right? Who disconnect from physical, normal life, right? And search for spirituality. We find this in Christianity, very dominant, as well as in religions of the East. But Judaism does not seem to hold in that direction. There's an ambivalent view on Nazarites. The idea is found, of course, in the Torah, but it's not so clear that it's a desirable thing. That the Nazarite who does not drink wine, is that something good? Or maybe he has to bring a sin offering because he prohibited himself something which God allows. In other words, the Torah has an ambivalent attitude towards Nazarites, and Torah says no. One can find goodness not by breaking away from society, but life itself has the potential for goodness, for purity, for holiness. And if we're correct that this maybe is an underlying message behind the structure, that 3 + 3 + 1 structure, emphasizing goodness in days 3 and 6, then this can serve as an opening for the rest of Torah. The opening story sets the goal. God is the creator, and he created a world in which man can find goodness in this world on land, right? That is the ultimate goal. How do you find goodness? How do you fulfill all the potential of creation? Well, read on the rest of the Bible. Here are the instructions of how to find goodness in this world, not by separating oneself from all physical existence. The Torah doesn't hold that you have to be a Nazarite, doesn't view different physical aspects of human life in a negative light, whether it be food, the sex drive. All these are actually part of holiness, part of human life, right? And the Torah gives instructions. You should eat. Even the Torah says, "V'achalta v'savata u'verachta et Hashem." You should eat, and you should, fill yourself so you're satiated. You're not hungry. You don't only have to eat, bread and water. No, you could. God will give us the land of milk and honey with great fruits. You will eat, and you will bless God for all the goodness that he gave you. Similarly, with regard to sexuality, the first commandment that the humans are given in chapter 1 is to be fertile, right? Fill the land. And the Torah then will give instructions what sexual relations are allowed, when, with whom, etc., right? But all this as part of life within the physical world that was created, that can allow us to find goodness and connect with holiness as well. So to summarize, what we've seen today in our opening story is first we determined the boundaries of the first story, and we noted that the story includes, of course, the seventh day, counter to the chapter division, which shifted the seventh day to chapter 2. And then we began in our search for the message behind the first story, in addition to obvious ideas of God as creator, behind everything, and the ruler of the land, and also the idea of the source of the sanctity of the Sabbath. We also said that this opening story also has a hidden structure, 3 + 3 + 1 structure, which places the emphasis of goodness on the days that creation is related to land, hinting to humanity that we may find goodness on land. We don't have to disconnect from our worldly existence in order to find goodness, but rather the Torah believes we can find goodness in this land in a very positive view of the world, and this serves as the opening story in the Torah.